Ava, a bright and compassionate little girl, eagerly waits every week to give a simple cookie to the neighborhood garbage man, Tom, without ever knowing the deep struggles he faces. But one day, Ava's father, Daryl, grows curious about why his daughter insists on this weekly gesture and decides to follow Tom after his shift. What starts as a simple act of kindness quickly unravels into a heartbreaking discovery that leaves Daryl, and eventually the entire community, deeply moved to act. Why has Tom been quietly carrying so much burden? What did Daryl uncover that changed everything? Stay tuned to find out. And before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. If this story of unexpected compassion and resilience touches your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The soft morning light crept through the curtains of Ava's bedroom, painting her walls with a warm glow. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she lay still, listening to the quiet of the house. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, she threw off her covers and leapt out of bed. "It's Thursday," she whispered excitedly to herself, her small feet padding quickly across the wooden floor. Ava rushed down the stairs, her curly hair bouncing with each step. As she rounded the corner into the kitchen, the sweet aroma of freshly baked cookies enveloped her. There, standing at the counter, was her mother, Keisha, carefully arranging warm cookies on a cooling rack. "Mama," Ava called out, her voice filled with enthusiasm. Keisha turned, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Good morning, sunshine. You're up early today." Ava bounced on her toes, her eyes sparkling. "It's cookie day, Mama? Can I help?" Keisha chuckled, shaking her head fondly. "Of course, baby. Come on over here." With practiced ease, Keisha lifted Ava onto a sturdy stool next to her. Together, they began the familiar routine of preparing the cookies. Ava's small hands carefully placed chocolate chips into the dough, while Keisha mixed, their movements synchronized in a dance they perfected over many Thursday mornings. As they worked, Keisha glanced at her daughter, curiosity evident in her eyes. "Ava, honey, can I ask you something?" Ava looked up, her hands covered in flour. "What is it, Mama?" Keisha paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Why do you give Tom, the garbage man, a cookie every week? You've been doing it for a while now, and I just wondered." Ava's brow furrowed in thought, her little face serious. "Well, Mama," she began, her voice soft, "he looks like he's sad. I think he needs it." Keisha felt a warmth spread through her chest at her daughter's words. The innocence and empathy in Ava's observation touched her deeply. "That's very kind of you, baby," Keisha said, gently brushing a stray curl from Ava's forehead. "You have a good heart." As they continued their baking, neither noticed Daryl, Ava's father, standing in the doorway. He'd overheard their conversation, and a slight frown creased his forehead. Shaking his head, he walked into the kitchen, his mind already on the day ahead. "Morning, ladies," he said, heading straight for the coffee maker. "Morning, Daddy," Ava chirped, waving a flour-covered hand. Daryl smiled at his daughter, but couldn't shake the slight unease he felt. "Ava, sweetie, don't you think it's time to stop with the cookie thing? I'm sure the garbage man has plenty to eat." Keisha shot him a warning look, but Ava didn't seem bothered. "But Daddy, it makes him smile," she said simply, turning back to her task. Daryl sighed, pouring his coffee. He didn't understand why Ava had become so attached to this seemingly insignificant interaction. But he was busy, with meetings to prepare for and deadlines looming. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the day ahead. "I've got to run," he said, giving Keisha a quick kiss and ruffling Ava's hair. "Have a good day, both of you." As Daryl left, Keisha and Ava returned to their baking, the warmth of their shared activity filling the kitchen once more. Hours later, as the afternoon sun hung low in the sky, Ava sat by the window, watching the street intently. Her legs swung back and forth, barely touching the floor, as she clutched a carefully wrapped cookie in her small hands. "Is he here yet?" Keisha called from the kitchen. "Not yet, Mama," Ava replied, her eyes never leaving the road. Finally, the familiar rumble of the garbage truck filled the air. Ava's face lit up with excitement as she saw the large vehicle turn onto their street. "He's here, Mama," she called out, already rushing to the front door. Keisha watched from the window as her daughter, a tiny figure in a bright yellow dress, ran down the driveway. The garbage truck came to a stop, and out stepped Tom, a tall man with broad shoulders and a weathered face. Ava approached him, holding out the cookie with both hands. "Hi, Mr. Tom. I made you a cookie today. It's chocolate chip." Tom's tired eyes softened as he looked down at Ava. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, transforming his face. "Well, thank you, Miss Ava. That's mighty kind of you." He accepted the cookie gently, as if it were a precious gift. For a moment, the weariness seemed to lift from his shoulders. But it was fleeting. As quickly as the smile had appeared, it faded, replaced by a look of exhaustion that seemed bone deep. "You have a good day now, Miss Ava," Tom said, his voice gruff but kind. He climbed back into his truck, the cookie held carefully in one large hand. Ava waved enthusiastically as the truck pulled away. "Bye, Mr. Tom. See you next week." As Ava skipped back to the house, Keisha couldn't help but notice the slump in Tom's shoulders as he drove away. There was something in his demeanor, a heaviness that went beyond physical tiredness. It stirred a feeling of concern in her, but she pushed it aside as Ava burst through the door, chattering excitedly about her interaction with Tom. Over the next few weeks, the Thursday routine continued. Ava would wake up early, help Keisha bake cookies, and wait eagerly for Tom's arrival. Each time, the exchange was brief but meaningful. Ava's bright smile and innocent gesture seemed to bring a moment of light to Tom's day, though his weariness never fully lifted. Daryl, despite his initial dismissal of Ava's weekly ritual, found himself paying more attention to these interactions. He began to notice the subtle changes in Tom's demeanor when Ava approached him. The way his shoulders would straighten slightly, how his eyes would soften, the ghost of a smile that would appear on his face. One Thursday morning, as Daryl was leaving for work, he paused in the driveway. He watched as Ava ran out to meet Tom, cookie in hand. This time, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. As Tom accepted the cookie, there was a flicker of emotion in his eyes, gratitude mixed with something deeper, something almost like pain. Daryl frowned, a nagging feeling of curiosity growing in his mind. He couldn't shake the sense that there was more to Tom's story than met the eye. But what could it be? And why did this simple gesture from his daughter seem to affect the man so profoundly? As he drove to work, Daryl found his thoughts returning to Tom and Ava's interaction. He tried to focus on his upcoming meetings, on the reports he needed to review, but the image of Tom's weary eyes and Ava's innocent smile kept intruding. That evening, as Daryl sat in his home office reviewing documents, Keisha knocked gently on the door. "Hey," she said softly, entering the room. "You've been quiet tonight. Everything okay?" Daryl leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." Keisha perched on the edge of his desk, her eyebrows raised. "About?" Daryl hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's about Ava and that garbage man, Tom. Have you noticed how he reacts when she gives him that cookie?" Keisha nodded slowly. "I have. It seems to mean a lot to him." "That's just it," Daryl said, leaning forward. "It seems to mean too much. I can't shake the feeling that there's something more going on here." Keisha's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Daryl shook his head, struggling to articulate his thoughts. "I don't know exactly. It's just the way he looks when he takes that cookie. It's like it's more than just a nice gesture to him. Like it means something deeper." Keisha was quiet for a moment, considering Daryl's words. "Well," she said finally, "maybe it does. Maybe that small act of kindness from Ava is more important to him than we realize." Daryl nodded, still lost in thought. "Maybe. But why? What's his story?" Keisha reached out, placing a hand on Daryl's arm. "Does it matter? Ava's doing a kind thing, and it seems to brighten his day. Isn't that enough?" Daryl looked at his wife, seeing the gentle reproach in her eyes. He sighed, knowing she had a point. "You're right. I'm probably overthinking this." But even as he said the words, Daryl couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Tom's story. The image of the man's tired eyes and the fleeting smile when Ava handed him the cookie stayed with him, a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. As the weeks passed, Daryl found himself paying more attention to the Thursday morning exchanges. He'd delay leaving for work, watching from the window as Ava ran out to meet Tom's truck. Each time, he noticed the same thing, the brief moment of lightness that came over Tom's face, quickly replaced by that deep-seated weariness. One morning, as Daryl was about to leave for work, he overheard Ava talking to Keisha in the kitchen. "Mama," Ava said, her voice serious, "I think Mr. Tom needs more than just cookies." Keisha paused in her cleaning. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "Well," Ava continued, her little face scrunched in concentration, "he always looks so sad, even when he smiles. Maybe he needs a friend." Daryl felt a pang in his chest at his daughter's words. He marveled at her intuition, her ability to see beyond the surface. It made him wonder, what was it that Ava was seeing that he couldn't? As he drove to work that day, Daryl's mind was filled with questions. Who was Tom really? What was the story behind those tired eyes? And why did a simple cookie from a little girl seem to mean so much to him? Daryl realized that his curiosity had turned into something more, a genuine concern for this man who had become a small but significant part of their lives. He found himself wanting to know more, to understand what lay behind Tom's weary exterior. But how could he find out? He couldn't very well just walk up to Tom and start asking personal questions. And yet, the mystery nagged at him, a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. That night, as Daryl lay in bed, sleep eluding him, he made a decision. He would find out Tom's story, one way or another. Not out of idle curiosity, but out of a growing sense that perhaps there was something he could do to help. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Daryl's last thoughts were of Tom's tired eyes and Ava's innocent smile. Two very different expressions, linked by a simple act of kindness. And somewhere in that connection, Daryl felt, lay a story waiting to be discovered. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Daryl found himself awake, his mind already churning with thoughts of the day ahead. It was Thursday, and for weeks now, this day had taken on a new significance in their household. As he lay in bed, listening to Keisha's soft breathing beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. With a quiet sigh, Daryl slipped out of bed and made his way downstairs. The house was still silent, but he knew it wouldn't be long before Ava burst into the kitchen, eager to start her weekly cookie-baking ritual with her mother. As he sipped his coffee by the kitchen window, Daryl's thoughts drifted to Tom, the garbage man who had unknowingly become a central figure in their Thursday mornings. The more he observed Tom's interactions with Ava, the more unsettled Daryl felt. The sound of small feet padding down the stairs broke through his reverie. Ava appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair a mess of curls, eyes bright with excitement despite the early hour. "Daddy, you're up early," she exclaimed, rushing to give him a hug. Daryl chuckled, lifting her into his arms. "Just wanted to see my little cookie baker in action," he said, ruffling her hair. As Keisha joined them and the familiar baking routine began, Daryl found himself more attuned to every detail of the morning. He watched as Ava carefully wrapped the freshly baked cookie, her small hands moving with surprising precision. He noticed Keisha's fond smile as she observed their daughter's concentration. And then the moment arrived. The rumble of the garbage truck echoed down their street, and Ava's face lit up with excitement. "He's here, Mama. Can I go now?" she asked, practically bouncing on her toes. Keisha nodded, and Ava was out the door in a flash. Daryl moved to the window, watching the scene unfold as he had so many times before. But this time, he forced himself to look closer, to see beyond the surface of this weekly exchange. Tom stepped down from his truck, his movements heavy with fatigue. As Ava approached, Daryl saw the subtle shift in Tom's posture, the way he seemed to make a conscious effort to stand straighter, to summon a smile for the little girl. Ava held out the cookie, her face beaming with pride and kindness. "Here you go, Mr. Tom. I hope you like it." Tom's smile, though genuine, didn't quite reach his eyes as he accepted the gift. "Thank you, Miss Ava. You're very kind." The exchange was brief, as always, but Daryl found himself holding his breath, watching intently as Tom climbed back into his truck. As the vehicle pulled away, Daryl noticed something that made his heart clench, the way Tom's shoulders slumped, as if carrying an invisible weight. Ava skipped back into the house, chattering excitedly about her interaction with Tom, But Daryl's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of Tom's defeated posture, the weariness that seemed to envelope him like a shroud. Throughout the day, as Daryl sat through meetings and conference calls, his thoughts kept returning to Tom. Why did this small act of kindness seem to affect the man so deeply? What was the story behind those tired eyes? As he drove home that evening, Daryl found himself taking a detour, passing by the local garbage disposal facility. He slowed down as he approached, scanning the parked trucks for any sign of Tom. But the lot was nearly empty, the day's shift long over. At home, Daryl was quieter than usual during dinner. Keisha noticed, shooting him concerned glances across the table, but he brushed off her unspoken questions with a smile and a shake of his head. Later that night, as they were getting ready for bed, Keisha finally broached the subject. "All right, spill it," she said, sitting on the edge of their bed. "What's been eating at you all day?" Daryl sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's Tom," he admitted. Keisha's brow furrowed. "The garbage man? What about him?" Daryl sat next to her, struggling to put his feelings into words. "I can't shake this feeling that something's not right. The way he looks when Ava gives him that cookie, it's like it means everything to him, but at the same time, it's breaking his heart." Keisha was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "Maybe he's just going through a rough patch," she suggested gently. "Times are tough for a lot of people right now." "I know, but—" Daryl trailed off, shaking his head. "I can't explain it, Keisha. It feels like there's more to the story." Keisha placed a hand on his arm. "Daryl," she said softly, "are you sure this isn't about something else? I mean, we don't really know anything about Tom." "I've thought about that," he admitted. "But this feels different, Keisha. It's about the pain I see in his eyes, the way he carries himself. Something's weighing on that man, and I can't help but wonder if there's something we could do to help." Keisha studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "So, what are you thinking of doing?" Daryl took a deep breath. I think I'm going to follow him after his shift tomorrow." Keisha's eyes widened. "Follow him?" "Daryl, that's Dash." I know," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "It sounds crazy, but I just want to make sure everything's all right. If I'm wrong, if it turns out he's fine and I'm just imagining things, then that's that. But if there's something going on, if there's a way we could help." Keisha was quiet for a long moment, her expression a mix of concern and understanding. Finally, she sighed. "Just be careful, okay? And if you're wrong about this, you come straight home and we forget all about it." Daryl nodded, relief washing over him. "I promise. I just want to make sure everything's all right." The next morning, Daryl woke even earlier than usual. He moved quietly around the house, careful not to wake Keisha or Ava. As he sipped his coffee, he ran through his plan in his mind. He'd follow Tom at a distance, just to see where he went, to get a glimpse of his life outside of their brief Thursday morning interactions. As the familiar routine of the morning unfolded, Ava baking cookies with Keisha, the arrival of the garbage truck, Daryl felt a knot of anticipation in his stomach. He watched from the window as Ava handed Tom the cookie, noting once again the mix of gratitude and sadness in the man's eyes. When Tom's truck pulled away, Daryl turned to Keisha. "I'm heading out," he said quietly. "I'll call you later." Keisha nodded, worry evident in her eyes. "Be careful," she said softly. "And Daryl, remember, whatever you find, or don't find, Tom's entitled to his privacy." Daryl nodded, giving her a quick kiss before heading out. He got into his car and drove to the garbage disposal facility, parking across the street where he could see the entrance. Then he waited. Hours ticked by. Daryl watched as trucks came and went. Workers changed shifts. He was beginning to think he'd missed Tom somehow when he finally spotted the familiar figure walking out of the facility. Tom looked even more exhausted than he had that morning, his shoulders slumped, his gait slow. He climbed into an old, beat-up car and pulled out of the lot. Taking a deep breath, Daryl started his engine and began to follow at a discreet distance. They drove through the city, heading towards the outskirts of town. Daryl's curiosity grew with each passing mile. Where was Tom going? Finally, Tom's car turned into a small, run-down trailer park. Daryl drove past slowly, then parked a little way down the road. He sat there for a moment, his heart pounding. What was he doing here? Was he really going to intrude on this man's life based on a hunch? But the memory of Tom's tired eyes, the weight of sadness he seemed to carry, spurred Daryl on. To Daryl's surprise, Tom's truck pulled into a small, run-down trailer park. Confusion replaced his earlier suspicions. This wasn't what he had expected at all. He parked his car a short distance away and watched as Tom climbed down from his truck. Tom looked around furtively before hurrying towards one of the trailers. It was an old model, its paint peeling and steps sagging. Daryl's breath caught in his throat as he saw a small, pale face through the window. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, her features gaunt, but her eyes bright with recognition. As Tom disappeared inside the trailer, Daryl sat back in his seat, his mind whirling. Who was that girl? Why was Tom visiting her in the middle of his route? Unable to contain his curiosity, Daryl quietly got out of his car and moved closer to the trailer. He knew he was crossing a line, but he couldn't stop himself. As he approached, he could hear muffled voices from inside. "Emma, sweetheart, how are you feeling today?" Tom's voice, usually gruff, was soft and filled with concern. "I'm okay, Dad," came a weak reply. "Just a little tired." Daryl's heart clenched. "Dad?" The girl was Tom's daughter? He edged closer to a window, careful to stay out of sight. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see into what appeared to be a small bedroom. His breath caught in his throat at the sight. The room was cramped, dominated by a hospital-style bed. Medical equipment crowded the small space, monitors for stands and machines Daryl couldn't identify. And there, propped up on pillows, was the girl he'd seen in the window. Emma. She was painfully thin, her skin almost translucent. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but there was a spark of life in them as she looked at her father. Tom sat on the edge of the bed, holding her hand gently. "I brought you something," Tom said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the cookie Ava had given him that morning, carefully wrapped in a napkin. Emma's face lit up, a weak smile spreading across her features. "Is it from the little girl?" Tom nodded, his own smile tinged with sadness. "Yeah, it's from Ava. She made it special, just for you." Emma took the cookie with trembling hands, bringing it to her nose to smell. "It's chocolate chip," she said, her voice filled with a joy that seemed too big for her frail body. "My favorite. Why don't you save it for later?" Tom suggested gently. "After your treatment. It'll be something to look forward to." Emma nodded, carefully placing the cookie on her bedside table. "Dad," she said, her voice suddenly serious, "you don't have to keep bringing these to me. I know the little girl gives them to you. You should enjoy them." Tom shook his head, squeezing Emma's hand. "No, sweetheart. Knowing that you enjoy them, that they bring a little brightness to your day, that's worth more to me than any cookie." Daryl felt like an intruder, witnessing this intimate moment between father and daughter. The tenderness in Tom's voice, the love shining in his eyes. It was a far cry from the weary, defeated man Daryl thought he knew. As he watched, a nurse entered the room, pushing a cart with various medical supplies. "Time for your treatment, Emma," she said kindly. Tom stood up, his face a mask of worry and fatigue. "I've got to get back to work, sweetheart. But I'll be here tonight, okay? We can watch that movie you like." Emma nodded bravely, though Daryl could see fear in her eyes. "Okay, Dad. I love you. I love you too, Emma. More than anything in this world." As Tom turned to leave, Daryl quickly retreated to his car. His mind was reeling from what he'd witnessed. Tom wasn't involved in anything sinister. He was a father struggling to care for a very sick child. From his car, Daryl watched as Tom emerged from the trailer. The man's shoulders were slumped, his movements heavy with exhaustion and worry. He climbed back into his garbage truck and drove away, returning to his route as if nothing had happened. Daryl sat in his car for a long time, unable to move. The scene he'd witnessed played over and over in his mind. He thought about the cookie, how something so simple had become a lifeline of joy for a sick little girl. He thought about Tom, working long hours in a grueling job, carrying the weight of his daughter's illness alone. Finally, Daryl started his car and began the drive home. The city passed by in a blur as his mind grappled with the reality he'd uncovered. He'd been so wrong, so quick to assume the worst. The guilt sat heavy in his stomach. As he drove, memories began to surface, memories he'd long tried to forget. He remembered a time, years ago, when his own family had struggled. When Ava was just a baby, Keisha had lost her job, and they'd found themselves drowning in bills. The stress had been overwhelming, the fear of not being able to provide for their child all-consuming. They'd been fortunate. Family had stepped in to help, Keisha had found a new job, and they'd managed to pull through. But Daryl remembered the sleepless nights, the arguments born of fear and stress, the feeling of utter helplessness. Tom didn't seem to have that support system. From what Daryl had seen, he was facing this enormous challenge alone. The thought made Daryl's heart ache. As he pulled into his driveway, Daryl sat in the car for a moment, gathering his thoughts. How could he have been so quick to judge? He'd let his suspicions override his compassion, had invaded a man's privacy based on nothing but vague hunches. The front door opened, and Keisha appeared, her face a mixture of relief and concern. Daryl realized with a start that it was late afternoon. He'd been gone for hours. "Daryl? What happened?" "I've been trying to call you," Keisha said as he got out of the car. Daryl looked at his wife, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. "Keisha," he said, his voice thick, "I was wrong. So wrong. Keisha, you won't believe what I found out." Over the next hour, as they sat at the kitchen table, Daryl recounted everything he'd seen. He told Keisha about the trailer park, about Emma and her illness, about the cookie and what it meant to both Tom and his daughter. As he spoke, Daryl could see the emotions play across Keisha's face. Shock, sadness, and finally, a deep empathy that mirrored his own. "Oh, Daryl," she whispered when he finished, her voice barely audible. "That poor man? That poor little girl." Daryl nodded, feeling the weight of the situation anew. "I know. I can't stop thinking about them, Keisha." The way Tom looked at Emma, the love in his eyes, and the fear. He's carrying so much on his shoulders. Keisha reached out, taking Daryl's hand in hers. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. Daryl looked at her, a mix of relief and uncertainty washing over him. I don't know. I mean, we can't just ignore this now that we know, but how do we help without revealing that I invaded their privacy?" Keisha was quiet for a moment, her mind clearly racing. "Well," she said slowly, "we start small. Ava's cookies seem to mean so much to Emma. What if we sent more? Or maybe a care package?" Daryl nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "That's a good start. And maybe we could do more. I was thinking about reaching out to some of my contacts in the medical field, see if anyone has connections that could help with Emma's care." As they continued to brainstorm, their ideas grew bolder. Keisha suggested involving the neighborhood, creating a support network for Tom and Emma. Daryl's initial hesitation gave way to excitement as they mapped out a plan. "We could organize a fundraiser," Keisha said, her eyes shining. "Something discreet, of course. We don't want to embarrass Tom." Daryl nodded, but a flicker of worry crossed his face. "That's what I'm concerned about, Keisha. Tom seems like a proud man. What if he sees this as charity? What if we end up pushing him away instead of helping?" Keisha squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We'll be careful, Daryl. We'll approach this with sensitivity. Tom needs to know he's not alone, that his community cares about him and Emma." As they continued to discuss their plans late into the night, a sense of purpose filled the room. They were no longer just passive observers of Tom's struggle. They were taking action, becoming part of the solution. The next morning, Daryl woke early, his mind already racing with plans. He started with his immediate neighbors, carefully explaining Tom's situation without divulging too much personal information. Mrs. Johnson, the retired nurse next door, listened with tears in her eyes. "Oh, that poor dear," she said, referring to Emma. "I have some medical supplies left over from when my Frank was ill. They might be of use." Mr. Patel, who owned the local grocery store, immediately offered to put together food packages. "No one should have to worry about feeding their family when they're dealing with a sick child," he said firmly. As Daryl moved from house to house, he was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. People he'd barely spoken to beyond a casual hello were now opening their hearts and their homes, eager to help. Sarah, a young lawyer who lived down the street, offered her services pro bono. "I can help navigate the insurance maze," she said. "It's the least I can do." Even old Mr. Grumpy, as the neighborhood kids called him, surprised Daryl. "I'm good with my hands," he grumbled. "Trailer probably needs some fixing up. I can do that." By midday, Daryl's head was spinning with the offers of help pouring in. Money, food, medical supplies, legal aid, home repairs. The community was rallying in ways he hadn't dared to hope for. As he walked home, his heart full of gratitude, Daryl spotted Tom's garbage truck turning onto their street. For a moment, he froze, unsure of what to do. But then he straightened his shoulders and walked towards the truck. "Morning, Tom," he called out, trying to keep his voice casual. Tom looked up, surprise flickering across his tired face. "Morning," he replied, his tone guarded. Daryl took a deep breath. "Listen, Tom, I was wondering, my daughter Ava, she really enjoys baking those cookies for you. I was thinking maybe she could bake some extra? If you have anyone you'd like to share them with, I mean." Tom's eyes widened slightly, a mix of emotions crossing his face. For a moment, Daryl feared he'd overstepped. But then Tom's shoulders seemed to relax, just a fraction. That's real kind of you," Tom said softly. "I do know someone who might appreciate that." Daryl nodded, his heart racing. "Great. That's great. And Tom, if there's ever anything you need, anything at all, we're here. The whole neighborhood, we're here." Tom looked at Daryl for a long moment, his eyes searching. Then he gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As Tom drove away, Daryl felt a mix of hope and anxiety. It was a small step, but an important one. They'd open a door, offered a hand. Now they just had to hope Tom would be willing to take it. Over the next few days, Daryl and Keisha worked tirelessly to coordinate the neighborhood's efforts. They set up a discreet system for collecting donations, organized a schedule for meal deliveries, and began putting together care packages filled with essentials and small comforts. Throughout it all, Daryl couldn't shake his nervousness about Tom's reaction. Every time he saw the garbage truck, his heart would race, wondering if this would be the day Tom confronted him, accused him of overstepping. "What if we're making things worse?" he confided to Keisha one night. "What if Tom feels like we're intruding?" Keisha wrapped her arms around him, her presence a calming force. "We're doing this out of love, Daryl. Tom may be proud, but he's also a father. He'll understand that we just want to help Emma." As the week progressed, their plans began to take shape. Sarah, the lawyer, had made progress in navigating Emma's insurance issues. Mr. Grumpy, whose real name they discovered was Gerald, had assembled a team to repair Tom's trailer. Mrs. Johnson had organized a group of retired medical professionals to offer their expertise. The day before they planned to approach Tom with their offer of help, Daryl found himself standing in front of the mirror, rehearsing what he would say. "Tom, we know about Emma," he practiced, then shook his head. "No, that sounds too confrontational." "Tom, the community wants to help." "No, too vague." Keisha appeared in the doorway, a soft smile on her face. "Just speak from your heart, Daryl. That's all you need to do." Daryl turned to her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if he rejects our help? What if we've misread everything?" Keisha stepped forward, taking his hands in hers. "Then we'll know we tried. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think Tom needs this help, even if he doesn't know how to ask for it." As they stood there, drawing strength from each other, they heard the patter of small feet. Ava appeared in the doorway, her arms full of freshly baked cookies. "Daddy, Mama, look. I made extra cookies for Mr. Tom's daughter. Do you think she'll like them?" Daryl felt his heart swell with love and pride. He knelt down, pulling Ava into a hug. "I think she'll love them, sweetheart. You're doing a wonderful thing." As he held his daughter, Daryl felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about helping Tom and Emma anymore. It was about teaching Ava the power of compassion, about showing her what it meant to be part of a community. That night, as Daryl lay in bed, his mind raced with all the possibilities tomorrow could bring. He imagined Tom's face when they revealed the community's plans to help. Would there be relief? Gratitude? Or would there be anger? A sense of invaded privacy? Despite his anxiety, Daryl felt a glimmer of hope. They were doing the right thing. He was sure of it. Tomorrow would be a turning point, not just for Tom and Emma, but for the entire community. As he drifted off to sleep, Daryl's last thoughts were of a little girl in a hospital bed, smiling over a homemade cookie. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, that image would be his guiding light. They were going to make a difference. They had to. The morning sun peeked through the curtains, casting a warm glow across Daryl's face as he stirred from his restless sleep. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, before the weight of the day ahead came rushing back to him. Today was the day they would approach Tom with their offer of help. Daryl sat up, running a hand through his hair. Beside him, Keisha was already awake, her eyes meeting his with a mix of determination and apprehension. "Today's the day," she said softly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. Daryl nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Today's the day," he echoed. They went through their morning routine in a haze of nervous energy. As Daryl poured his coffee, he caught sight of Ava carefully arranging cookies in a decorative tin. Her little face was scrunched in concentration, tongue poking out slightly as she made sure each cookie was perfectly placed. "That looks beautiful, sweetheart," Daryl said, his heart swelling with pride. Ava looked up, beaming. "Do you think Emma will like them, Daddy? I made extra chocolate chip ones." Daryl knelt down beside her, pulling her into a gentle hug. "I'm sure she'll love them, Ava. You're doing a wonderful thing." As he held his daughter, Daryl felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about helping Tom and Emma anymore. It was about teaching Ava the power of kindness, about showing her what it meant to be part of a community that cared for one another. The morning passed in a blur of last-minute preparations. Keisha coordinated with the neighbors, ensuring everyone was ready for their roles in the plan. Mrs. Johnson double-checked the medical supplies she'd gathered. Mr. Patel called to confirm he'd put together a month's worth of groceries. Sarah, the young lawyer, dropped by with a folder full of documents she prepared to help navigate Emma's insurance issues. As the time for Tom's usual route drew near, Daryl found himself pacing in the living room, rehearsing his speech one last time. "Daryl," Keisha said gently, placing a hand on his arm to still his nervous movement. "Remember what I said? Speak from your heart. That's all you need to do." Daryl took a deep breath, nodding. "You're right. I want to get this right, Keisha. For Tom. For Emma." "I know," she said, pulling him into a hug. "And you will. We all will." The familiar rumble of the garbage truck filled the air, and Daryl felt his heart rate spike. This was it, the moment of truth. "Ava, sweetie," Keisha called. "Mr. Tom is here. Are you ready with your cookies?" Ava came bounding down the stairs, carefully cradling the tin of cookies. "Ready, Mama?" Together, the family stepped out onto the front porch. Daryl could see Tom's truck making its way down the street, the man's tired figure visible behind the wheel. As Tom pulled up in front of their house, Daryl took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. It was now or never. "Morning, Tom," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. Tom climbed down from the truck, his usual weariness evident in his movements. "Morning," he replied, his tone guarded as he glanced between Daryl and Keisha. Ava stepped forward, holding out the tin of cookies. "Mr. Tom, I made extra cookies today. For Emma. Daddy said she might like them." Tom froze, his eyes widening as they darted from Ava to Daryl. For a moment, the air was thick with tension, and Daryl feared they'd made a terrible mistake. But then, to Daryl's surprise and relief, Tom's shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but as if a great weight had been lifted. His eyes, usually so tired and guarded, filled with tears. "How?" Tom began, his voice hoarse. "How did you know?" Daryl stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Tom, I followed you last week. I know I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry for invading your privacy. But when I saw Emma, when I understood what you were going through, Tom, we want to help." Tom looked at Daryl for a long moment, a myriad of emotions playing across his face: shock, anger, fear, and finally, a flicker of hope. "You want to help?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Keisha stepped forward, her voice gentle. "Tom, you're part of our community. You and Emma both. We've all come together, the whole neighborhood. We want to support you in whatever way we can." Tom's gaze swept over them, then down the street where other neighbors had begun to emerge from their homes, all wearing expressions of concern and support. I don't know what to say, Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. Daryl placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. You don't have to say anything, Tom. Just let us help. Please. For a moment, Tom stood silent, his eyes closed as if in deep thought. When he opened them again, there was a new light there, a glimmer of hope that Daryl had never seen before. Okay, Tom said softly. Okay. A collective sigh of relief seemed to sweep through the gathered neighbors. Daryl felt a weight lift from his chest, replaced by a surge of determination. Tom, he said, why don't you take the rest of the day off? We can go see Emma together, explain everything to her. I'm sure she'd love to try Ava's cookies. Tom hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Oh, yeah, that sounds good. Let me just call my supervisor. As Tom stepped away to make the call, Daryl turned to the gathered neighbors. Thank you all for being here, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. This is just the beginning. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Tom, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, could only watch in stunned silence as his neighbors sprang into action. Mr. Patel arrived with his van full of groceries, stocking Tom's kitchen with enough food to last for weeks. Mrs. Johnson and her team of retired medical professionals pored over Emma's records, making calls to specialists and discussing treatment options. Sarah, the young lawyer, sat with Tom at the kitchen table, explaining the progress she'd made with Emma's insurance company and outlining the steps they'd take next. Outside, Mr. Grumpy Gerald and his team had already begun work on repairing Tom's trailer, the sound of hammering and sawing filling the air. Through it all, Daryl stayed by Tom's side, offering quiet support and answering questions as best he could. He couldn't help but notice the way Tom's posture had changed. The man stood straighter now, as if the burden he'd been carrying for so long was finally being shared. As the afternoon wore on, Tom turned to Daryl, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't know how to thank you all, he said, his voice rough with emotion. It's more than I ever could have hoped for. Daryl squeezed Tom's shoulder. You don't have to thank us, Tom. This is what community is all about. Now, what do you say we go see Emma? I bet she's wondering where her cookie is. Tom nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Yeah, let's go see my girl. They went on their way to see Emma, who was just shifted to the hospital 2 days ago. The drive to the hospital was quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts. Ava sat in the back seat, the tin of cookies held carefully in her lap, her eyes wide as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. As they walked through the hospital corridors, Daryl could feel the tension radiating from Tom. He placed a reassuring hand on the man's back, offering silent support. When they reached Emma's room, Tom paused at the door, taking a deep breath. Then, with a nod to Daryl, he pushed it open. Emma was sitting up in bed, her pale face lighting up at the sight of her father. Dad, you're early today. Tom moved to her bedside, enveloping her in a gentle hug. Hey, sweetheart, I've got a bit of a surprise for you today. Emma's curious gaze fell on Daryl and Ava, who were hovering in the doorway. Who are they, Dad? Tom gestured for them to come in. Emma, this is Mr. Daryl and his daughter, Ava. They're friends of ours. Daryl stepped forward, smiling warmly. It's nice to meet you, Emma. We've heard a lot about you. Ava, suddenly shy, peeked out from behind her father's leg. Hi, she said softly. I made you cookies. Emma's eyes widened. You're the cookie girl? Dad tells me about your cookies all the time. Ava giggled, her shyness forgotten. She moved to the bedside, carefully placing the tin on Emma's lap. I made extra chocolate chip ones, and your dad said they were your favorite. As Emma opened the tin, her face lit up with delight. They smell amazing. Thank you so much. While the girls chatted, Daryl pulled Tom aside. Tom, he said quietly, there's something else we need to talk about. Something important. Tom's brow furrowed with concern. What is it? Daryl took a deep breath. We've been talking to some specialists about Emma's condition. There's a new treatment that's showing promising results for cases like hers. It's experimental, but Tom's eyes widened. But what? Daryl, please, if there's any hope. The treatment is expensive, Daryl continued. Very expensive. But Tom, we've set up a fundraiser. The whole community is contributing. We think we can make this happen. Tom staggered slightly, and Daryl reached out to steady him. You do that? For Emma? Daryl nodded, his eyes serious. In a heartbeat, Tom. Every single one of us. Tears spilled down Tom's cheeks as he pulled Daryl into a fierce hug. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you so much. As they broke apart, both men wiping at their eyes, they turned to see Emma and Ava watching them curiously. Dad? Emma asked, her voice tinged with worry. Is everything okay? Tom moved to her bedside, taking her hand in his. Everything's more than okay, sweetheart. In fact, things are about to get a whole lot better. Over the next hour, they explained everything to Emma. The community's support, the potential new treatment, the hope that had seemed so out of reach just days ago. Emma listened with wide eyes, her grip on her father's hand tightening as she absorbed the news. So, I might get better, she asked, her voice small but filled with hope. Tom nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead. That's right, baby. We're going to fight this thing with everything we've got. As they prepared to leave, promising to return the next day, Emma called out to Ava. Thank you for the cookies, she said. They're the best I've ever had. Ava beamed, her chest puffing up with pride. I'll bring you more tomorrow, she promised. And maybe we can play a game or something? Emma nodded enthusiastically. I'd like that a lot. As they walked back to the car, Daryl couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at how much had changed in just one day. The weight that had been crushing Tom for so long seemed to have lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism. You know, Tom said as they drove home, I've been so focused on just getting through each day, on keeping Emma's spirits up, I forgot what it was like to have hope. Daryl nodded, understanding all too well. Hope is a powerful thing, Tom, and you're not alone anymore. Remember that. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The fundraiser, organized by Keisha and supported by the entire community, exceeded all expectations. Local businesses donated goods and services for a silent auction. A benefit concert was organized, featuring local musicians who volunteered their time and talent. The story of Tom and Emma touched hearts beyond their small community. Local news picked up the story, and soon donations were pouring in from all over the city. Through it all, Tom seemed to walk in a daze, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. I don't know how I'll ever repay everyone, he said to Daryl one evening, as they sat on the newly repaired porch of his trailer. Daryl shook his head. That's not how this works, Tom. We're not keeping score. We're just doing what neighbors do, taking care of each other. As the weeks passed, Emma began her new treatment. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, there was real hope. Emma's doctors were cautiously optimistic, noting improvements in her condition that they hadn't dared to hope for before. Tom continued his work as a garbage collector, but now he walked with his head held high, his shoulders straight. The neighbors made sure to greet him warmly each week, often sending him off with care packages for Emma or offers of help. Ava and Emma's friendship blossomed. Despite the age difference, the two girls formed a bond that touched everyone who saw them together. Ava visited Emma in the hospital regularly, bringing not just cookies but games, books, and endless chatter about school and friends. One sunny afternoon, about 2 months after that fateful day when Daryl had followed Tom, the community gathered for a special celebration. Emma had been released from the hospital for a day visit, her first time out in a long while. The local park had been transformed. Streamers and balloons decorated every tree. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes brought by every family in the neighborhood. A banner stretched between 2 trees read, "Welcome home, Emma." As Tom's car pulled up, a cheer went up from the gathered crowd. Daryl watched, his heart full, as Tom helped Emma from the car. She was still thin and pale, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Ava broke away from the crowd, running to greet her friend. "Emma, you're here." The two girls hugged, giggling, as Tom looked on with tears in his eyes. Daryl moved to stand beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Welcome home, Tom," he said softly. Tom turned to him, his eyes shining. "Daryl, I don't know what to say. This is all because of you. Because you cared enough to follow me that day." Daryl shook his head. "No, Tom. This is because of you. Because you love your daughter so much that you inspired an entire community to come together. We just needed to know how to help. As they watched Emma being surrounded by well-wishers, Tom spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. You know, when Emma first got sick, I was so angry. I kept asking, why us? Why my little girl? But now I think I understand. Daryl looked at him quizzically. Understand what? Tom gestured to the gathered crowd, to Emma laughing with Ava, to the banner fluttering in the breeze. All of this, Emma's illness, it brought us all together. It showed us what we're capable of when we care for each other. Daryl nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. You're right, Tom. It did. As the afternoon wore on, the park was filled with laughter and conversation. Emma, though tiring quickly, seemed to glow with happiness as she was passed from one neighbor to another, each offering words of encouragement and support. Keisha found Daryl sitting on a bench, watching the scene with a contented smile. She sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. You did good, honey, she said softly. Daryl wrapped an arm around her. We did good, he corrected. All of us. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Tom stood up, gently tapping a spoon against his glass to get everyone's attention. I'd like to say something, if that's okay, he began, his voice shaky but determined. A hush fell over the crowd as all eyes turned to Tom. A few months ago, I thought I was alone in this world. It was just me and Emma, fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. He paused, swallowing hard. But then you all came into our lives. You showed us what it means to be part of a community, what it means to care for your neighbors. Tom's voice grew stronger as he continued, his eyes glistening with emotion. You gave us hope when we had none. You fought for Emma when I didn't have the strength left to fight. And I will never, ever be able to thank you enough for that. He looked down at Emma, who was sitting in a wheelchair beside him, her small hand clasped in his. But I promise you this, I will spend the rest of my life trying to pay it forward, to be the kind of neighbor, the kind of friend that each of you has been to us. Tom took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the gathered faces. Emma's fight isn't over. We have a long road ahead of us. But thanks to you, we're not walking that road alone anymore. And that makes all the difference in the world. As Tom finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the park. Applause broke out, growing louder and louder until it seemed to fill the air with its thunderous approval. Daryl felt Keisha squeeze his hand, and he looked at her to see tears streaming down her cheeks. We did this, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. We really did this. Daryl nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He watched as neighbors surged forward to embrace Tom and Emma, offering words of support and encouragement. Ava appeared at Daryl's side, tugging on his sleeve. Daddy, she said, her eyes wide. Did we really help make Emma better? Daryl knelt down, pulling his daughter into a hug. We helped, sweetheart, but Emma's the one doing the hard work of getting better. We're just here to support her and her dad. Ava nodded solemnly. I'm glad we could help. Emma's my friend now, and I want her to get better. As the evening wore on, the celebration began to wind down. Emma, exhausted but happy, needed to return to the hospital. As Tom prepared to leave, Daryl approached him one last time. Tom, he said, I just wanted to say, I'm proud to call you my friend. Tom's eyes welled up again as he clasped Daryl's hand. Thank you, Daryl, for everything. You changed our lives. As they watched Tom's car drive away, Keisha slipped her arm around Daryl's waist. You know, she said thoughtfully, when you first told me about following Tom that day, I thought you were crazy. Daryl chuckled. I thought I was crazy too. Keisha looked up at him, her eyes soft. But you saw someone in need, and you couldn't just stand by. That's one of the things I love most about you, Daryl. Your heart. Daryl pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I learned from the best, he murmured. As they walked home, Ava skipping ahead of them, Daryl reflected on the journey of the past few months. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a little girl giving a cookie to the garbage man, had snowballed into something so much bigger, so much more profound. It had brought a community together, had shown them the power of compassion and collective action. It had given hope to a father and daughter who had all but lost it. And it had reminded everyone involved of the fundamental goodness that exists in people, if only given the chance to shine. That night, as Daryl tucked Ava into bed, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy," she said, "can we keep helping people? Like we helped Emma and Mr. Tom?" Daryl felt his heart swell with pride. "Of course we can, sweetheart," he said softly. "In fact, I think that's a wonderful idea." As he turned out the light and closed Ava's door, Daryl made a silent promise to himself. They would keep helping, keep reaching out, keep building this sense of community. Because he had seen firsthand the miracles that could happen when people came together with open hearts and helping hands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, as Daryl climbed into bed beside Keisha, he felt a deep sense of peace. They had done good, and they would continue to do good. As he drifted off to sleep, Daryl's last thoughts were of Emma's smiling face at the park, of Tom's heartfelt words, of the warmth and love that had filled the air. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that this was just the beginning of something beautiful. In the quiet of the night, as the neighborhood slept, a sense of unity and purpose seemed to settle over the community. The story of Tom and Emma had changed them all, reminding them of the power of compassion and the strength found in unity. And in homes across the neighborhood, people fell asleep with hearts full of hope and minds full of plans. Plans to keep this spirit of community alive, to continue reaching out to those in need, to make their little corner of the world a better place. For in the end, that's what it was all about. Not just helping Tom and Emma, but rediscovering the bonds that tied them all together. Rediscovering what it truly meant to be neighbors, to be a community. And as the stars twinkled overhead, it seemed that the future was bright indeed for this small, compassionate community that had learned the true power of a simple act of kindness. As autumn leaves began to paint the neighborhood in vibrant hues of red and gold, the impact of the community's efforts for Tom and Emma continued to ripple outward. The story of their unity and compassion had spread beyond their small corner of the world, inspiring others to look out for their neighbors and lend a helping hand where needed. For Daryl, the change was most evident in the little things. The way neighbors now stopped to chat on the street instead of hurrying past with a quick nod. The increasing number of community events and gatherings. The sense of connection that seemed to permeate every interaction. One crisp Saturday morning, as Daryl raked leaves in his front yard, he saw Tom's truck pull up. Emma hopped out, her movements still careful, but noticeably stronger than before. She wore a bright knit cap that covered her head, now bare from the treatments, but her eyes sparkled with life. "Mr. Daryl," she called out, waving enthusiastically. "Guess what? The doctors say I'm doing really well." Daryl leaned his rake against a tree and walked over to greet them. "That's fantastic news, Emma. I'm so happy to hear that." Tom, looking more rested than Daryl had ever seen him, smiled broadly. "They're talking about possibly ending the treatments in a few months if her progress continues," he said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. As they chatted, Ava emerged from the house, her face lighting up at the sight of her friend. "Emma, want to jump in the leaves with me?" Soon, the sound of childish laughter filled the air as the two girls played, tossing armfuls of leaves at each other and flopping into the piles Daryl had so carefully raked. Watching them, Tom's eyes grew misty. "You know," he said softly to Daryl, "there were times I thought I'd never hear her laugh like that again. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done." Daryl clasped Tom's shoulder. "We're just glad we could help. And honestly, Tom, you and Emma have given us so much more in return." As the girls continued to play, Daryl filled Tom in on the latest community initiatives that had sprung up in the wake of Emma's fundraiser. A neighborhood watch program had been established, not just for safety, but to keep an eye out for anyone who might need help. A community garden had been started in a vacant lot, with the produce being shared among neighbors and donated to local food banks. And, Daryl added, a hint of excitement in his voice, "We're in talks with the city about turning that old abandoned building on Oak Street into a community center. A place where we can offer after-school programs, job training, health clinics, you name it." Tom shook his head in amazement. "It's incredible how much has changed in just a few months. It's like the whole neighborhood has come alive. As they talked, more neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the sound of laughter and conversation. Mrs. Johnson brought out a tray of her famous pumpkin muffins. Mr. Patel arrived with his grandchildren, who quickly joined Ava and Emma in their leaf-jumping adventures. Before long, the impromptu gathering had turned into a full-fledged block party. Someone brought out a portable speaker, filling the air with music. Folding tables appeared, laden with potluck dishes. Children ran back and forth between yards, their shrieks of laughter a joyful soundtrack to the day. As the afternoon wore on, Daryl found himself standing slightly apart, taking in the scene before him. He felt Keisha's arm slip around his waist and leaned into her embrace. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, resting her head on his shoulder. Daryl smiled, gesturing to the lively gathering. "Just thinking about how different things were a few months ago. How isolated we all were, wrapped up in our own lives." Keisha nodded. "It's amazing what can happen when people come together, when they open their hearts to each other." As they watched, they saw Tom engaged in an animated conversation with Gerald, formerly known as Mr. Grumpy. The two men were laughing, Gerald's usual scowl replaced by a genuine smile. "You know," Daryl said thoughtfully, "I keep thinking about that first cookie Ava gave to Tom. How something so small could lead to all of this." Keisha squeezed his hand. "It's like that old saying, a single act of kindness throws out roots in all directions, and the roots spring up and make new trees." Daryl nodded, feeling a swell of emotion in his chest. "I just hope we can keep this going, that it's not just a momentary thing." As if on cue, Sarah, the young lawyer, approached them, her eyes bright with excitement. "Daryl, Keisha, I just heard back from the city council. They've approved our proposal for the community center." A cheer went up as Sarah shared the news with the gathered neighbors. Soon, people were forming committees, volunteering their time and skills to bring the community center to life. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Daryl found himself standing with Tom once again. "You know," Tom said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion, "when Emma first got sick, I felt like my world had ended, like there was no hope left. But now," he paused, looking around at the vibrant community surrounding them, "now I feel like we're part of something bigger, something important." Daryl nodded, understanding completely. "We are, Tom. We're part of a community, a real one." As the impromptu party began to wind down, with neighbors helping to clean up and saying their goodbyes, Daryl felt a tugging on his sleeve. He looked down to see Ava, her eyes heavy with tiredness but shining with happiness. "Daddy," she said, stifling a yawn, "can we do this every weekend?" Daryl chuckled, scooping her up into his arms. "Maybe not every weekend, sweetheart, but I promise we'll do it often." As he carried his sleepy daughter back to the house, Daryl looked back at the street, now quiet but somehow still buzzing with the energy of the day. He realized that this sense of connection, of shared purpose, was what truly made a neighborhood a home. And as he tucked Ava into bed that night, Daryl knew that the story of their community was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Ava's simple act of kindness and Daryl's decision to follow his heart led to a life-changing discovery that touched not only Tom and his daughter, but also the entire community. Together, they showed the power of compassion and unity in the face of struggle. If Ava and Tom's story moved you, be sure to subscribe for more inspiring tales of empathy and resilience. And before you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Daryl's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below.